Hey everybody! Today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite authors, Herman Melville. I mentioned him a little bit in my last video. I showed you the second Library of America volume of his works, which includes Moby Dick. This is the third and final volume of his works, which includes his late novels and short stories. I think some of his best work. Look at the man's beard. How can a man with a beard like that not be a great novelist? I don't actually have the first volume of his novels because, to be honest, his early writing is a little bit lightweight. He initially received fame as sort of a travel writer. He was a sailor. He traveled around in the South Pacific, and he wrote about his stories, and the plots are pretty thin. It's basically, I went to an island, I met the natives, I had some fruit, and I left. And ironically, those are the stories that made him the most money. That's what got him started as a writer, made him pretty popular. But hasn't really held up over the years. The literary worth is nothing near where he got to in the end, which is funny because when I say early work, his first novel came out in 1846. His last novels came out just barely a decade later. Moby Dick is 1851. His last novel was 1857. He really had a career of only about 11 years of writing, and we'll see what happened there in the course of this video. The novel I want to talk about today is the novel that came directly after Moby Dick, Pierre, right there. And I can honestly say Pierre is one of the strangest books I've ever read. When the reviews were released, one of the reviews simply said, Herman Melville, insane. It's a really deeply weird book, and it may surprise you coming from an author like him, but his evolution as a writer really took him into some weird places. Moby Dick was very philosophical and very unpopular with the press and with the audience and with audiences. And afterwards, he just delved into this really deeply bizarre novel called Pierre. It's basically, in a nutshell, it's about this very young man who lives in this sort of Arcadian, beautiful farmland and just has a great time with his mother and his girlfriend and is very peaceful. But then he meets his long-lost sister, and he travels into the city, and it just gets darker and darker and more twisted as it goes along, and it's very strange. You can get an idea for how strange it is based on the novel. It takes place in America, but the hero's name is Pierre Glendinning, which is not the name of any American I've ever heard of. And one of the things when I first read it that struck me is how bad the beginning is. The beginning that takes place in this farmland and is all peaceful and pastoral is written with a lot of these and thous. It's written in very old-fashioned language. It's super overwrought and over the top. Lots of really flowery language, very unlike a lot of his other work. And at first when I read it, I thought, this is so bad. What's going on here? What is he writing? And I realized as I read more of it, and I've read it twice now, he's doing it on purpose. It's sort of a satire of earlier, like 18th century writers who were very flowery. And he starts out in this very romantic, over-the-top style, but as it goes along, it gets grittier and grittier, and it actually ends up being really modern. It seems shockingly modern for something that came out in the 1850s. Really a stylistic tour de force, and just a crazy book that nobody's read. Everybody's read Moby Dick because they have to in high school, but nobody's read this. I've got two editions of it. The edition here is the Library of America version, which is as originally published. The first version I read actually was a different edition that I found in a used bookstore called the Kraken edition. It had illustrations by Maurice Sendak, who did Where the Wild Things Are. And the Kraken edition makes some edits, which, as something of a literary purist, I was initially skeptical about the edits, but the story is kind of interesting. Basically, Melville had finished Pierre and sent it to the publishers, ready to go to publication when Moby Dick was out and starting to get reviewed, and the sales figures were starting to come back in. And everybody hated Moby Dick, and the reviewers hated it. It didn't sell well, and Melville had worked really hard on it. He considered it his masterpiece, and he was extremely disappointed and very bitter that the book wasn't doing well. So he called the manuscript back from the publishers. He inserted all these chapters about Pierre, the hero, trying to become a writer in the big city. And it's basically just an excuse to put in these bitter screeds against the literary critics and the book-buying public for having no taste and not knowing what they're doing, and how cruelly America treats its authors. And it's really has nothing to do with the rest of the plot, completely out of place. And so the Kraken edition, which I found, cuts out all that and restores the original manuscript, and it's marginally better. I don't think the editions are too bad, but I think the slimmer edition that just contains the original story is a little more concise and better. It's amazing to me how unsuccessful Herman Melville was in his own lifetime. As I said, he made his living off of these travel stories from when he was a sailor, and then he started, in a very short period of time, just a couple years, started writing these great sea adventures like Redburn and White Jacket, and I want to talk about those in a different video. But like really nice adventure stories, really good, and those did okay. And then he started writing these deeply philosophical, very elaborate, ornate novels, like Moby Dick was the first one. Pierre, he wrote a couple others afterwards, some short stories called the Piazza Tales. And the public just hated them. The critics hated them. They were way too modern, too advanced, too philosophical. They just wanted nice adventures in the South Seas. And he's made virtually no money. As I said, his literary career was about 10 years, 11 years. And then he lived another 37 years after that. So you can only imagine how embittered he must have been in his old age, having written these great novels and being completely forgotten. And it's ironic because now, of course, he's considered, rightly, I think, one of the greatest novelists of all time. And he's personally my favorite American novelist. I won't say favorite overall, but of the Americans, I think nobody does better than Herman Melville. And Pierre, I think Pierre is a 5-star novel. It's wildly experimental. It's unlike anything I've ever read. It's really, everyone uses the word unique. Pierre is truly unique. I've never read anything like it. It's so strange. It's so over the top. It gets violent. There's incest. There's murder. It's dark. It's just a crazy book. And if you're a fan of Melville's style of writing, some people find him kind of turgid and wordy, but I like that about him. If you find anything enjoyable about his writing, I'd suggest checking out Pierre as a very unknown, under-recognized masterpiece. My name is Logan Albright. If you've enjoyed this, I'm also a writer. I've got books for sale. You can check out the link in the description for Amazon.com. I'll bring you new book reviews every weekend. Thank you very much. See you next time.